Alright, good morning everyone. How you all doing? Thanks for showing up when you didn't have to. So, who's ready for a pop quiz? Well, the good news is it's not a pop quiz in the sense you may be thinking. It's optional to participate in. Bonus points. So, who can describe an entity to me? First person to raise their hand, Amon. Okay. Yeah, that's right. There you go. All right. And who can describe an attribute to me? First hand I see. Attribute, what is it? Yeah. So when you convert this to a database, like Boone was saying, you're going to have, the attributes become your columns. That's exactly right. So they're going to describe, of course, the entity. All right. Who can tell me the difference between a primary key and a foreign key? First hand I see. Different table or entity, I'd accept either of them. So, yeah, like, let's see. Like Carson was saying, Carson, right? Okay, got a little cheat sheet here. I can cheat, you guys can't cheat. How about that? The only reason I'm cheating is because I got a huge disadvantage. I only see eyes, and even that's kind of iffy, from a distance. So, anyway, yeah. So basically, primary key uniquely identifies each of the instances. Now, who can tell me what an instance is? What is an instance? Boone. That's exactly right. You did some studying, didn't you? All right. So, let's see. Is there any other questions I want to ask? Yeah, there are. Who can tell me what redundancy is? Yeah. Not necessarily the same data sets, but the same data. So, it could be the same data set, but most of the time we're talking about redundancy. It's like, imagine if we had a transaction table and we repeated the customer street address over and over and over. That's redundant. What we could do instead is we could have separate tables for customer, which would have their address, have some sort of customer ID, uses a foreign key inside of the transaction table. That way, if we wanted any information about the customer, we only have it in one field as opposed to going to all the fields we could possibly have. That's the whole point of doing these ERDs. Okay? You want to eliminate redundancy. Does that make sense? All right. See if there's one more question I could ask. Make sure I get those back at the end of class, by the way. Can't really think of anything. I'll be generous. I'll pass one out to everyone here. We'll pass that over to one for you, one for him. How about that? Let's see. You'll pass this one down. Actually, tell you what. I want you to do me a favor and pass all of these out. So, one for you, and figure the rest out. All right. So, that said, we did one example of an ERD last class. It was, of course, the bank. So, any questions about the bank? Does that make sense to everyone? Like I said, the most important principle here is we want to think about this in the context of how can we eliminate repeating information. So, the main way to do this is to, if we have information that repeats, break it down. For example, on the bank entity, if we were so inclined, let's say that we believe that a large number of our customers shared a street address. They shared a residence. Okay, so they all had, let's say 123 Sesame Street. That's my go-to street address. Okay, let's say we have multiple people living here. Okay, and let's say that each address on average had 2.2 residents who were customers. Okay, so maybe you have a married couple, husband and a wife living together, and maybe they have a 16-year-old who has an account. That would be 3 people at the same residence. Does that make sense? Okay, let's say that you had one person living alone. That'd be 1 person at the residence. But there's enough people that it could make sense to split that up. So what you could do is, instead of having all the information for the residents inside the customer table, just make a unique key for each of the different addresses and have that as a foreign key inside the customer table, then have an address table. Does that make sense? So you could do that. In the case of an address, is that really saving that much? I don't think it is. If this number were 5, which it wouldn't be, but let's say it were 5, then could you make an argument to get rid of it? Absolutely. But at 2, does it really make a lot of sense to do so? I would argue you're not saving a ton. But it depends on the size of the table. So you're a small bank. Say you have 2,000 customers. Okay, is it worth saving, let's see, so you've got an address, it's going to have roughly 5 fields times 2.2. So you got 5 times 2.2, and you're going to multiply that number by the number of customers you have. So, for a couple thousand customers, you're not saving a ton. But if you have millions of customers, then would this make more sense, or could it make more sense? Yeah. Because what do we know about processing? Okay, processing is going to be dependent upon how many records you have. And it's going to be dependent upon the size of those records. So, in that case, it can certainly make sense to have smaller tables, if possible. Like I say, on any of the tables we're doing on here, we won't really see that because I'm not going to give you a data set that's going to be, gigabits of size or gigabytes of size. But, it would be possible that if you choose to become a database administrator at some point in your career, that would be something to know. Does that make sense? And the main reason I'm not giving you very large databases is because Canvas doesn't really have a great way to do that. I could share them another way, but like I said, just get kind of messy. So, does that make sense? Also, what's the point of doing them? I mean, it's something most of you won't face. Not really a huge point in going into great detail about. So, you guys ready to do an employee example? Okay. So, first thing what I want to do is just think about all the different entities we're going to have. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this guy. Let's see. I'm going to copy it 4 times. Like I said, the reason I'm copying it this way is because, for whatever reason, the default font on these isn't really readable. It's a lot easier to do it this way. So, like I said, just kind of skipping a step here, but it'll be for a good reason. Okay, so we want to get employees at their firm, and we want to get some certain information. So, let's go ahead and say that we want to get the employee information, obviously. We get information about the department. Get information about their pay. What are some more things we might want to get? Benjamin. We could get some employee history. I don't know why we couldn't. Boone. So that's probably going to be inside the employee entity here. Amon? I think we could probably make an argument to put that under pay. We wouldn't have to, but we could. I think we could get away with putting it under pay, let's say that. But we could certainly have a separate table for sort of like to get the specific hour history. We could. It's going to keep it a little bit simpler, but you're right, you could. So I think that's probably a good starting point. So, obviously, if we want to get information about employee, what do we probably want to have? An employee entity. Okay. Want to get information about department? What are we going to have? A department entity. Okay, we want to get information about pay. Get a compensation, call it pay. Let's call it pay. Pay is a little bit shorter. This is a fair bit shorter. Employee history. I don't like the term employee history. What else could we call this? Let's see. Let's see. I'm trying to get like employee file stuff, right? Like discipline, not compensation, but like commemorations, that sort of stuff. What's a better term than history? How about employee file? Just call it that. And then let's see here. That's all we want for now. We'll probably keep another table around just in case. Let's go to the employee table. Can we just use an employee ID and call it a day for the primary key? Yeah, I don't see why not. It's our company. We can do whatever we want, basically. So, employee ID is going to uniquely identify each of the instances of employee. So, if we were to have an employee starting, what would we do? We'd assign them an employee ID. That's very common. Okay? So, just like with customer, we're going to want to get a lot of information about these people. So, we're going to need their F name. We're going to need to have their L name. And I'm going to copy a bunch of these attributes here and just kind of make it a little bit easier to work with. Let's go ahead and change this to M name. Because just like with the case of the bank customers, do we need to report certain information about our employees? Yeah, we do. Okay, what else do we need to know about our employees? So we're certainly going to need to have their address, just like before. We're going to not put this all on one attribute. We're going to split it up. So we're going to have add 1, add 2, copy and paste this. Okay, city, state, zip. And I should note that with these attribute names, you have a lot of flexibility. It'd be better practice if I were going to have multiple addresses inside of the database. It would be better practice to use the attribute name followed by like zip. So for example, on the bank example, pretty sure we did customer add 1. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it was cust add 1. Either way, kind of have something about the entity that it's inside the attribute name. In this case, we're only going to have one address though, because we could have added a branch to the bank ERD. We chose not to, but we could have. And as we know with a bank, we have a lot of different locations, don't we? So we do. And in this context, it's going to make sense to have, when we're talking about an employee, we're going to assume that the company only has one location. Does that make sense? So is that a fair assumption? Maybe, maybe not. We're making it though. So unless you're told, or unless common sense would tell you to do so, there's a lot of businesses that only have one location. There's not a lot of banks that only have one location. Does that make sense? So that's why we're assuming this. Just want to kind of clarify that. And like I say, unless you're explicitly told one way or the other, it's your discretion. Okay. What can't you do with attribute names? Good bonus point question. What's something you cannot do? Boone. That's exactly right. What do you do instead, Boone? Exactly. So you don't put spaces in the names of attributes. Like Boone was saying, you can do a couple different things. You can use camel case. That's what I tend to do. I think it's a little bit easier to work with. If you're so inclined, you can use underscore symbol. You can use a dash. There's lots of different options. Unless you're explicitly told what to do on instructions, what am I going to accept? pretty much anything that's reasonable other than a space. Okay, does that make sense? So, like I said, don't be too concerned with that. All right, so we got the address. Now, what's some more stuff we may need? A few more fields, definitely going to need. Okay, social security number, that's certainly one. Let's think about some others. There are employees. Do we need to get a hold of them sometime? You're going to need to know a phone number. Okay, what you got? Date of birth is very important as well. So date of birth, call it DOB. Like I said, you really do have a lot of flexibility with your names of the attributes. Just be reasonable. That's all I ask. So, got their date of birth, have their phone. What about email? Is email important? Probably. Okay, let's move on. We'll come back to this because there's one more thing we definitely want to put, but we're going to get to that. Okay? So, department. Is it fair to assume that department names are going to be unique? Are we going to have two departments that are different departments but have the same name? There are cases where that could happen. That's very rare. For example, some universities have different econ departments. Okay? Why do they have different econ departments? One of them is in the College of Business, one of them is in the College of Arts and Sciences. Okay, that's not uncommon, but you know, we're going to assume that's not the case. We're going to assume in this case that the department name is unique. Does that make sense? I'm not saying it would always be unique, but I think it's fair in most contexts for business to assume they're not going to have two of the same department with the same name that are different departments. So we're just going to go ahead and change this to department name. Okay. Let's see. What else do we need to know about the department? How about its department main office? Okay. So we're going to assume each department has some main office. Maybe it's the department administrator, maybe it's the department manager, whatever. We're going to assume that. Okay, speaking of manager, let's go ahead and get that too. Manager. Okay, we're going to assume that each department has one manager. And what are we going to do with this manager? What are we going to do with it? It's going to be a foreign key because it's going to reference employee ID. Does that make sense? Okay. So for pay, let's say that we have a company, and let's be honest. You know, there's no point in sugarcoating this. Are all employees paid the same? No. In fact, even if you have the same position, are you paid the same? It depends on the company, but we're not going to assume that they are. We're going to assume that each employee has a unique salary ID that's unique to them. Okay? In addition, if you work for a company for 5 years, is it somewhat likely that your salary will change? Let's phrase this a different way. Is there a non-zero chance your salary will change? So there's obviously a non-zero chance your salary will change. Hopefully it'll increase. But you don't know that it'll increase, but you know, it's very rare your salary would decrease, because what's going to happen if they decrease your salary? Yeah, you're probably going to quit. And maybe that's what they want. But, you know, in most cases that wouldn't be what they want. Okay? So salary ID, so we're going to have time initiated, or let's call it date initiated. Check this marker out. It's got a little built-in eraser. Pretty nifty, huh? Date begin. Date end. And what do we know about date end? This one can certainly be null, okay, because we may not have a date end. What if we don't have a date end? What does that mean? It's the current salary, okay? So, have date begin, date end. What else do we need to have? Yeah. Yeah, so you got to have the figure. And then finally, salary type. And this type variable is going to be used to tell if it's hourly or if it's, you know, whatever the type is. Okay, those 4 things are going to be what we need to have. All right, does that make sense? Did I lose anyone? Okay. So, like I said, first thing is sal ID. Second thing is begin date, end date, sal amount, and finally, we want to have the sal type. Because some employees are going to be paid hourly, some are going to be paid by commissions, some are going to be paid by, annually, with a traditional sort of salary. Lots of different options, okay? That's what the sal type variable is there for. So, does that make sense so far? Okay. Now, we also want to have some information about positions, okay? I think I spelled that right. So, we have a position title. We're going to assume that's going to be unique. Maybe there's a pay scale, maybe there's not. Let's make it simple and assume there is no pay scale. Well, let's assume that a position belongs to a department. So, for example, let's say we have an accounting department for a company of, a couple thousand employees. So they're going to have, what type of positions may they have? How about accountant 1, accountant 2, senior accountant, whatever. That's stuff you could see. So we're just going to say this belongs to a department. Now, could different departments have the same position? In some cases, they could. But if the business rule states that each department has unique positions, then no, they couldn't. Does that make sense? So you could make an argument to not include anything about department. We're not going to do that. Okay, and like I said, we don't have a pay scale for a company. It's done on the employee basis. So we know the department name is the primary key for the department table. It uniquely identifies each of the instances of department. What does that mean when we have department down here in position? Yeah, that's exactly right. It's foreign key. Okay. And finally, let's get some stuff about employee file. So for employee file, what we could do is we could call it file no. Okay, for file number. We could call it other things too, but I'm going to call it file no in this context. Because for each of the different files, an employee, here's why employee ID is not a good number. Let's say that we have an employee who has a file, and let's say that their file has more than one record. Would employee ID uniquely identify each of those records? No, it wouldn't. Okay? Let's say that an employee gets multiple awards in one day. Then would employee ID and date uniquely identify each of those? No, they wouldn't. Or let's say the opposite is true. Let's say an employee gets written up for multiple things in one day. It's probably not going to be in the database for very long, if you know what I mean. But, ignoring that, even employee number and date may not be unique. That's why we're using file number. So for each of the different files, it is going to have a unique ID. Does that make sense? Like I said, feel free to stop me with any questions. Okay. So let's call it report type. This variable can be used to tell if it's like a commendation, like they got an award. It can be used to tell if it's like a annual report. It can be used to tell if it's a infraction. Okay. So maybe the employee committed a violation. If they committed a violation, that's going to be in the report type. Okay. And then here's the cool thing. We can put a description. Okay, we can just say DESC. And this can describe the thing that's in the employee file. So while up to this point, like for example, address we split up via different things, it doesn't really make sense to split up a big description of whatever is inside the employee file. Because there's not really context where we'd want to get like the first sentence or like the first word. Does that make sense? With address, you may very well want to get the zip code out. you may very well want to get a part of that out. There's a lot of different reasons you may have to do that. For example, let's say you are being challenged. Let's say you're a bank and you're being challenged via equal opportunity for fair housing. Okay? Would it be important to know the zip codes of people? It'd be vital. Okay? That's going to be very important. Now, let's say that you're looking for something in the employee file. You're not really going to have one piece of information you can parse out from the description. That's why you can just leave it to the description and have it be one attribute. It's going to be probably a very long actual thing. Does that make sense? Any questions? All right, you guys ready to form the relationships here? Or not quite. Well, let's go ahead and start. Okay. So, employee to department. So right now, we're missing one important thing, but we're going to assume for the context of this that employee belongs to one and only one department. Okay? So, employee has one and only one department. Department has 0 to many employees. Could we make this an n-to-many relationship? We could. We could say the department must have at least 2 employees. So it could be 2 to many. I think I'm going to make this 1 to many. But again, like I say, unless you're given the business rule, it's your judgment. If you are given the business rule, use whatever the business rule is. I could, on an exam, for instance, I could say that departments can have no more or no fewer than 6 employees. What are you going to do? Okay? You're going to, come up here, put a little 6. Okay? I'm not saying to do this, but I'm saying if you're told to do this, this is what you would do. That make sense? So, I don't know if I'm going to do that on an exam or not. I could, but I don't know that I would. Kind of depends on my mood when I'm making the exam. So, like I said, we're not going to do that, but that's how we would do it. All right. Now, what do we need to have to tell what employee or what department an employee is in? If we're assuming they're only in one department, what do we need to have? We need to have a foreign key, don't we? So let's just copy this guy, paste it below, and let's just call it department. Okay, like I said, the name of the foreign key does not have to match the name of the primary key. Okay, it can, but it does not have to. So it's not a primary key. I'm going to remove that. But it's a foreign key. Does that make sense? Because it must reference the department. Otherwise, if we have a database that has all this information about the employee, just because it has that relationship doesn't mean we can actually determine what department an employee belongs to. You have to have the foreign key present. And I'll also make a note that you have to have the foreign key present where it has the one and only one. So employee has one and only one department. Therefore, you put the primary key from department in the employee table. Okay. It wouldn't make sense to put the employee ID inside the department table, would it? Because is there going to be a single department that has an employee? Well, there could be. But are there going to be departments with more than one employee? Yeah. So if you have one attribute here for employee, it just doesn't make sense to include it there. Does that make sense? So you have to put it on that side with the one-to-one. All right. So let's go ahead and see here. Is it fair to make a relationship from, say, pay to employee? I think that's certainly fair to do. I'm just trying to snap the relationship there. Okay, let's think about what this relationship would look like if I can ever get it to connect. It doesn't always cooperate as much as I would like, but we'll get there. All right, so employee, we know that the employee has a salary. In fact, we should probably put an employee variable there, shouldn't we? Because we know that the salary is unique to an employee. Does that make sense? So, what should we do? We should add in a new variable, or new attribute, I should say. We're going to call this employee ID. Let's call it emp ID to match. So you don't have to match, but it can be a good thing to match. So obviously this is not a primary key, but it is a foreign key. Okay? So the employee is going to have how many minimum salaries? They're going to have at least one salary. If they don't have a salary, what are they not? They're not an employee. That's exactly right. But a salary is going to belong to what? If we know that it has employee ID as a foreign key, what does that mean about that relationship? From salary to employee. One and only one. Okay? Salary belongs to one and only one employee. Make sense? Okay. So let's go ahead and just tidy this up just a little bit here. One or more. Okay. Now, if we already have employee inside the pay table, or the pay entity, I should say, still in the ERD, do we have to put information about the department? If I want to figure out how much our department was paying for all of its employees, can I do that with these relationships I already have? Boom. It would be a little bit tricky to do, but yes, you're right, it could be done. And I would make an argument that even if it's a little bit tricky to write the query, it's still better because you're not having redundant information. If you have employee ID, you go over to the employee table, you can reference anything inside the employee table. If we scroll down, well, actually we won't have to scroll down, we have department inside the employee table. You can write a query that uses the employee ID in the pay table, grab the salary amount, for instance, and then you would grab the department from the department variable in the employee table. Be a little bit complicated, you're right, but it's possible. And we're going to worry about how to do it in a couple weeks. Does that make sense? For now, it's just how to model it. Hey, Mon. Technically, you don't, but it's usually best practice to reference it, because without it, like for example, many-to-many, you know, we talked about you can't uniquely identify each instance of the relationship. Well, that's why. Does that make sense? Because you can't have a foreign key that has multiple values. It's going to have one value. So each instance of department has one manager. Okay? There's not multiple managers in a department. Now, if there were a business rule that said there were multiple managers, what would that be? That'd be a many-to-many. Here's a good question I should ask. How are we going to fix the many-to-many if we could have multiple departmental managers? How would we fix that? That's right. What would that table look like? Let me ask you another way. What would the primary key for that table be? If we're going to add a new sort of entity here for manager, what would that primary key be? Not quite. Boom. So that's not quite it either. What you would do, you form an associative entity, call it like department manager, and you'd have department name and employee ID as your two primary keys. So I'll give you credit for that. Sorry, Boone. But basically that's what you would do. Okay, always do that when you're forming an associative entity. All right, so everyone with me. Now, again, we're not doing that in this example, but if we were to, If I had a business rule that said departments can have more than one manager, that's what you would do. Does that make sense? I want to make sure this is clear. This is important. It's going to be on the exam. It's going to be stuff you need to know. It's going to be all around important. Okay. So let's move position down here for the time. Actually, let's go ahead and make it. So we know that department has positions. Let's go ahead and make that relationship. So if we were to make this, I don't really like how this looks, but it's passable. Okay, I don't like having the break in the relationship. It's not really a break, but it's not my favorite thing, but it'll work. Does that make sense? Try not to cross them if you're drawing them on pen and paper. Sometimes it's avoidable. It's unavoidable. If it's unavoidable, just try not to have like 50 things. You guys ever been through Atlanta? Driven through Spaghetti Junction? It's a crazy junction. See if I can pull a picture up of it. Let's just see what we've got here. It is just absolutely nuts. Man, there's so many different roads going every which way you wouldn't believe it, Spaghetti Junction. It's a really famous sort of intersection of a bunch of different roads. Yeah. This guy right here. Like I say, that's what driving through Atlanta's like, okay? It's Kentucky. I want to get the one in Atlanta. Let's see. Here we go. Yeah. So you don't want to have that. Does that make sense? You want to avoid that. And, you do that by sort of placing the entities in good spots. But we're not going to worry too much about it for now. It's just one thing. So department has, let's say, 0 to many positions, and position is held by, we said earlier, the business rule was what? One and only one department. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do that. So I've got it backwards right now. Won't be the last mistake of the day. Okay, so department has 1 to many positions. Position is held by one and only one department. Does that make sense? Now what's the last relationship we need? Employee file to employee. And in fact, what's one very important thing we're missing inside the employee file? Yeah, exactly. Employee ID. Okay, because the employee ID is going to be unique to the employee, and obviously that's going to be a foreign key. It is not going to be a primary key. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that relationship. Sometimes I really don't like working with this way that it snaps, but that's okay. Okay. So, we know that employee file belongs to one and only one employee. So, one and only one employee. And then we know that the employee can have more than one employee file. A good question is, would they have at least one? I don't think they have to. Maybe their hiring would be recorded in the employee file. I think you make a reasonable argument it's going to be a 0 to many relationship. Okay. We have about 15 minutes left. I'm not sure that's quite enough time to do a full-blown ERD. So we could probably get started on one, or I could take any questions. What would you all rather me do? Any opinions? Okay, we can certainly start one. Probably go a little bit quicker for this next one. Go ahead and save this guy. me just a second here. What was this, employee? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and make a new one. All right, and now for this next one, you guys have any ERDs you're dying to see? Anything you're just dying to see? That's certainly okay. How about, you guys remember we did the example of the student information system ERD. You guys remember that? And we had a little bit of stuff we could fix with it. So let's make it more logical. Okay, so the problems that it had sort of the instructor on there twice. And that was one problem. So instructor of course repeated. In fact, instead of calling it course, let's call it section. Okay, because it had section and then it had course, and that was the problem. And not only was it repeated, it was a different relationship too, so that was kind of weird. What was the other main problem with it? That was probably the biggest problem. But the second biggest problem, trying to think back to what the ERD had on there. So let's just say section and course were treated redundantly. I'm not saying they are redundant, but I'm saying they were treated redundantly. So to fix that, what are we going to do? Well, let's make a course entity. Let's make a section. So course, and we'll make a section entity as well. Let's put it over here. Section. Okay, so you guys know the difference between a course and a section, right? So a course, like a generic sort of course name. For example, this course is I think it's BA 223, and I'm pretty sure it's Introduction to Data Analysis. I might be off a couple words, but that's the gist of it. Okay, whereas a section, it's going to be a specific implementation of that course. So this is section, I think it's 4. Okay. Why is it section 4 and not section 1? Well, because it was added later than sections 1, 2, and 3. Does that make sense, the difference between a course and a section? So a course by itself doesn't have a professor. There's no one professor, well, maybe there are, but for most cases, section could have, a professor, but a course itself is not. And that's one of the main problems with that previous thing. So we know right off the bat we're going to need to have the subject, and we also know we're going to need to have the course number. Okay, because the course number by itself, are there other courses with the number 223? Yeah, there are. Are there other courses with the that have the BA prefix? Absolutely. The combination of those two are unique, though. There's not going to be another BA 223 course that is different than the course name. So last thing we need is course name. Everyone with me? Okay, so section, we need to have some information about it. And let's just think about what that may be. Obviously, we're going to need to have the subject, the course num, and the instructor. And we're going to figure out the primary key in a little bit, don't worry. Okay, but that's not all we need. Because am I teaching multiple sections of BA 223 this semester? I am. Therefore, even the combination of those first 3 are not unique. What does that mean? That can't be a primary key. Okay, so we need to have some more information on here. Let's put on location. Well, let's put on semester first. Okay, year. Let's do time, course time. It's going to tell you when the course is offered. Okay, finally, the combination of all 6 of these could be a primary key. Does that make sense? You confused? Who's confused? Okay, so if we don't have time in here, is it possible someone could teach the subject, course, have the same instructor, same semester, and same year? Yeah, because it's going to be formed with 6 different attributes. Anything 2 or more attributes is going to be a composite key. Okay, so if the combination of the attributes that form the primary key does not uniquely identify, it can't be a primary key. You have to keep going until you get something that uniquely identifies each instance. Okay, if we get year out of here, next year, is it possible that I could be teaching in the fall at this same time, this same course? Yeah. Same thing if we get semester out of here. Next semester. Well, I guess next semester is not a good idea. Let's go back a semester. Okay? Now, I'm not going to be a great example of this, but imagine another professor who would be. It's possible that in the spring they were teaching the same course at the same time. Yeah, so that's why you have to have all 6 of those form the primary key. That's a very important concept to understand. If we take out any one of those, it is possible that it would not uniquely identify each instance. Okay, as is, it is not. Now, we also need to know where the course is, don't we? Okay, so we're just going to come right here, add a new variable, and call it location. But here's the kicker. Does location need to be a primary key? Why or why not? Actually, it doesn't need to be a foreign key either. Okay, so it doesn't need to be a primary key or a foreign key, because is it even possible for 2 people to teach, or for one person to teach 2 different courses at the same time? I'd go so far as to say it would be technically possible. But here's the kicker. It wouldn't be the same course. Okay. I wouldn't be teaching 2 sections of BA 223 at the same time. There are going to be some cases where a course could be cross-listed. So it could be listed in one directory, or it could be listed as one thing, and the exact same course, the exact same room could be listed as a different thing. For example, let's say that we were sharing a course with College of Arts. And for us, it was interface design. For them, it was, I don't know, the art of interface. Exact same room, exact same course. That's possible. That's why we don't want to have location as a primary key. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is, even if that happens, it's going to be a different course name and course subject. Question? Because the combination of those, you can't take any one of those out and still uniquely identify the section. Does that make sense? So if I didn't have course number there, for instance, it is possible that it wouldn't uniquely identify the section. I'd say it's rare, but it is possible. Definitely semester, time, and year, and instructor are vital there. If you didn't have instructor as a primary key, you could substitute location if you're assuming that an instructor can only teach one course in one place at a time. Any other questions? Let's go ahead and see what this relationship would look like. Okay. So we know that course is going to have one-to-many sections, and section belongs to one and only one course. Okay, so right off the bat, we know that both subject and course num are going to be foreign keys because they come from the course table. That's where they originate. All right. So we want to change this. We could leave this at 0 to many from course to section. Because you could say, what if there's a new course that is released and it doesn't yet have a section associated with it? Could you make that business case? Yeah. Could you also make a business case that if it doesn't have a section, it's not a course? You could argue either way on that one. I actually tend to gravitate more toward leaving this as 0 to many, because I think there are new courses added all the time that maybe don't quite have sections yet. So kind of leave it up to you for how you want to do that. But definitely section is going to belong to one and only one course. That's not really an up for negotiation. Does that make sense? And again, that's because the primary key, part of it is literally subject and course. It means it can't be null, and it means that it can only be one thing. Okay? So that's why it has to be a one-to-one. One and only one. All right. I think that's about all the time we have today. Any last-minute questions? So an instance would be an occurrence of an entity. So for example, for course, BA223 would be an instance of a course. It's an occurrence. It's like an actual record. Any other questions? All right, have a great weekend. Or is it Friday?